some fun.
It's finally over. With nearly 2.5 hours of content behind us, we are rounding the final bend of this DPS journey we embarked on 2 months ago. To wind down a little, this last video is going to be a shorter one, as in not 50 plus minutes long, detailing all the inner workings of my testing. My hope is that through this final video, my testing results will be fully understandable and reproducible. On top of that, I wanted to go over my thought process when creating my testing methodology so that anyone trying to test damage on a similar scale in the future has a good reference point. Part 7. Damage Testing. This video will be split into 2 parts. First, an explanation of my testing process, and second, a walkthrough of my spreadsheet, which I know many of you have been asking for. Let's start with part 1. Testing. This entire series was spurred on by a realization that for an MMO-type game, D2 lacks 2 things: a publicly accessible API or tool that accurately tracks damage, think Warcraft logs, and realistic and accurate damage rotation testing that accounts for health bar versus wipe screen discrepancies in team environments. And so, I got to work. Boss selection. First, I'd need a testing dummy, one I could stick with for any and all of my testing decisions. That meant a boss with a normal model, classification, crit, modifiers, and for my sanity's sake, short mechanics before starting damage. On top of this, I wanted to test damage in a 6-man environment for certain tests, like those involving Pack Hunter, so I eliminated dungeon bosses from the get-go. As for the other factors, the Last Wish bosses all have non-standard crits and models, so those were out. Both the Garden bosses have lengthy mechanics leading up to damage and have annoying movement patterns or unique models, so those were also out. You can imagine how the rest of the raid bosses went. By the time I had eliminated the bosses that didn't meet my criteria, I was pretty much only left with Templar. The only problem with Templar was his detain mechanic, which instantly depletes grenade energy and stops player actions, and the fact that the relic super varies slightly in how much damage it does. However, those were problems I was more than willing to deal with given how ideal the rest of Templar's circumstances are. What do I mean by that? Modifier-wise, Templar is about as standard as you can get, and there's a huge upside to testing using the Big Hydra. By relocating the flag close to the relic using Eager Edge, you can start damage pretty much instantly every time you wipe. If I'd used a boss like War Priest or something similar, not only would I always need 3 people to do the encounter with, but I'd also need to get through over a minute of downtime and ad clear to even get to damage. Templar also has relatively low health for a raid boss, which meant that the Destiny damage tracker tool I was using to measure damage would be more accurate. I'll explain more of what this means later, but know that this was also a factor when it came to boss selection for this task. Chunking Avoidance. Now, I mentioned that I still had a few hoops to jump through before I was happy with the accuracy of my testing methods. Like many other bosses, Templar is susceptible to unexpected chunking based on in-game events, which results in his health bar taking additional damage that isn't represented visually or on the wipe screen. While testing solo mitigated the vast majority of these concerns, it seems that doing damage to Templar right after you break his shield with the relic, especially from a tick source like a solar or vortex grenade, occasionally causes huge chunks of damage to his health bar. In order to combat this, I started waiting a few seconds after breaking whenever I tested damage, and I retested every damage source that looked like it might be doing inflated damage as a result of unintended chunking. Health monitoring. And now for the most important part of my damage testing, and the main inspiration for this entire series. As part of the speedrunning community, I've long been familiar with the idea that Pack Hunter boosted rockets have inaccurate values on the wipe screen, but from experience, rockets melt every medium to high health boss in the game much faster than any other weapon-based option. While yes, we'd accepted that rockets and Wolfpack rounds in particular were definitely odd in how the game calculated their damage, none of this was an exact science, and that frustrated me. At a time in Destiny where linears had just been nerfed and new pretenders were emerging to lay claim to the damage thrown, I wanted a clear and precise answer to the age-old question in every endgame player's mind. If we can't rely on the wipe screen, what can we rely on? Around the same time, my friend Corolla unveiled a damage utility called the Destiny Damage Tracker tool. Like nothing ever seen before, DDT provides accurate boss damage values not by counting wipe screen numbers, but by literally measuring the number of pixels depleted from a boss health bar. And with that, I realized that DDT was the perfect solution to my problem. You see, when using rockets in a high player count team environment, bosses would fall over, but on the wipe screen you'd see total numbers that would be off by literal millions of damage, but the boss would still die when their health bar was depleted. That means one of 2 things. 1, the requirement for a boss dying isn't actually depleting a certain health amount, which the game's instance tracks like it does on the wipe screen. Or 2, the actual damage done to a boss is calculated in a separate step compared to what appears on the wipe screen. Either way, DDT would go on to assist me for the next month in determining just how much damage every viable option in the game does to Templar. Outlier Detection. Finally, I want to touch on one more important consideration when it comes to using health bar pixel measuring in order to test damage. Obviously, there are only so many pixels on my monitor, and while I do play on 1440p, that means a boss health bar is only around 845 pixels long. That means in the worst case scenario, any amount of damage that's below around 0.12% of a boss's health will register as having done nothing. For a boss like Templar, who has around 6.3 million health, that's an error margin of around 7500. I'll go over how I got Templar's health value later. For reference, against Templar, that's around 1 glaive melee. While you might not think that's a big deal, when we're testing to see if a weapon might be doing, say, 10% more health bar damage than what the game thinks it does visually, it can be problematic. Thankfully, I set up a few standards before I started really getting into the thick of testing. First of all, to account for any damage options that do a relatively small amount of damage like melees and certain grenades, I made sure to try my best to do around 100,000 or more damage. Since the error margin doesn't grow as you perform more and more tests, just doing more damage and then dividing your health depletion value by the number of shots or hits is a great way to minimize incorrect results. Second, I also accounted for the fact that the Relic Super itself was a separate instance of damage, one that might have an error margin of its own, given that it only does around 30,000 damage. By accounting for these conditions, I was able to successfully identify true outliers as opposed to testing anomalies, and I'll be presenting my findings on these damage sources in the next section. Spreadsheet. Given the absolute mountain of data I had to sift through after testing for 2 weeks straight, I decided that the only way to really organize everything was through a good old-fashioned spreadsheet dump. Since this insane array of numbers isn't the easiest thing in the world to navigate, I thought I'd take the time to explain how every single tab works, as well as my future plans for testing additional theories and strategies that myself or other members of the community have suggested. Values. Let's start with the Values tab. The purpose of this tab is to compile all the health bar values for every single individual damage option in the game. The first couple columns are informational, with the modifiers column providing details if I feel like it's not entirely obvious what the damage value is referring to. If there's nothing in the modifier column, assume that it's one shot, burst, or use of the weapon. The right side columns are where things get interesting. Going from left to right, we have wipe, count, percentage, actual, ratio, and deviations. Wipe is how much damage the game thinks this option did, either on the wipe screen or visually in-game. Count refers to how many times I use the weapon, whether that's in shots, grenades, or mags. Percentage is how much of Templar's health the weapon actually did, divided by the count value. The actual value to the right then takes this percentage and multiplies it by Templar's health in order to find the actual damage done to Templar based on the health bar and not the wipe screen. The reason I kept the raw percentage value is just in case I more accurately measured Templar's health down the road, which you'll find that I have changed the value to around 6.3 instead of 6.33 million in the bosses tab. Finally, the last two values actually tell me whether or not what I'm looking at is an outlier. First, the ratio column divides the actual value by the wipe value, which tells us how much more damage a weapon does to the health bar compared to what the game thinks it does. The deviations column does something similar, but in a more direct way. Remember how I said DDT has a Templar error margin of about 7500 health on a 1440p monitor? This column actually tells me just how many pixels off a result was compared to the expected value, which is a great way of directly seeing whether an option is truly doing more or less than it's supposed to. Speaking of outliers, let's talk about the significant ones that I found. Going down the list, we have any rocket with Pack Hunter, which I'll probably dedicate an entire video to, Bequest doing an additional 10 to 15% even after accounting for its higher impact stat, along with several other swords doing various amounts of increased health bar damage as well. Cloud Strike with 5% more than expected, Divinity, which does almost 30% less damage than expected if held down instead of tapping, Grand Overture at 10% extra, Izanagi's Burden at around 25% extra, Leviathan's Breath at 5% extra with no double damage glitch, Malfeasance at around 10% extra, Tractor Cannon at around 10% extra, Two-Tailed Fox at around 10% extra, various grenades which would usually overperform by about 10% at most, various supers, especially those affected by biotic enhancements, notably Glacial Quake at 15% and Hammer of Soul at 30%, with Nighthawk Golden Gun also doing an additional 10%, Mobius Quiver doing an additional 15 to 20%. And yes, before you ask, I accounted for all of these outliers in my damage ranking, meaning that all damage rotations use true damage values instead of wipe values. Rotations. Next up, we have the ranking and sequencing tabs, which I'll call the rotations section. Here, I devised a number of damage rotations that simulate what a real player would choose to do in order to maximize DPS against a real raid boss given a set of weapons. For example, if given Briar's Contempt as your primary damage option, the best idea would probably be to use Feast of Light boosted Blade Barrage, shoot a pre-honed Izanagi shot, then start dumping your linear until it's empty. Basically, I took every damage option people think might be good, and then I tried my best to run with it, as they say. The ranking tab acts as a visually pleasing summary that gives basic information about each rotation, including total reserves, the exotic armor the rotation ends up on, the weapons involved, and the super used, on top of a time to empty value, total damage, and DPS. Pretty simple. The sequencing tab, on the other hand, is a minefield of values and multipliers. Basically, if you want to see the math that went into how each total damage value was calculated, as well as the timings for every single input in a rotation, this is where you'd go. Some of you were a bit confused by why some of the time values and damage values are out of order. I wanted to keep every rotation's rows in the order of the actual inputs done, but some damage sources like threadling grenades take so long to do their damage after your input that their damage bleeds over and past the next input's damage ticks, especially if the next weapon is hit scan. You may have also noticed that the numbers in the raw column might be familiar. They are actually taken directly from the values tab, which makes sense. While the surges, buff, debuff, and mod columns are pretty straightforward, some commenters were asking about what specific roles each weapon is using. While the perk column can give you some hints, I plan on adding an equipment tab to the spreadsheet that includes the recommended exotic armor and weapon perks for DPS scenarios. For now, all of the recommended perks for legendary weapons can be found in the speedrunner shopping list sheet, which I'll link on screen and in the description. As for the input timings, I took the tightest inputs I could find while I was recording myself doing these rotations, and then I applied that timing to anything similar. For example, if it took me 0.983 seconds to swap from Sojourner's Tale to Galahorn while doing the double slug galley testing one time, but for the rest of the test it took 1 second or more, I took the minimum value since I know that's what's possible. As for edge cases, I made sure to get rid of the respawn quick swap glitch and also accounted for RPM lockouts when doing things like double aggressive swaps. Components. Let's talk about the components section, which encompasses the single, swap, and timing tabs. This section of the spreadsheet is designed to focus on individual sources of damage so that they can be compared and slotted into rotations. So why are there 3 tabs? The single tab takes each individual damage component, possibly with different reload options, and stretches damage out as far as it'll go without substantially losing damage. For example, Blade Barrage can only be cast once without a massive DPS drop, so it has a duration of 1.7 seconds, time from input to final damage tick. At the opposite extreme, grenades are capped at a minute of damage, given that they can be infinitely thrown at max throw rate with Field of Flame. This tab is less useful than the next one, but it gives me the ability to cover more options that wouldn't make sense in the swap tab, like Jolt, Arc Souls, and Trace Rifles. The swap tab is where things really get interesting. While I was testing damage rotations at a macro level, I started thinking about what a cool idea it would be if I could use the data I had acquired to actually determine the component DPS of a single damage source with its swap time included. Sure, we know how much damage Izanagi's Burden does when fired continuously, and we know how much damage it does per shot. But how much does it do in the context of a rotation? As in, if you swap to it, fire, hone, then stow at the perfect time, during that window of time, what's your DPS? And how does it compare to Horseman, or just shooting more rockets? These are all questions that are essential when it comes to calculating damage. So how do you actually calculate a damage candidate's swap DPS? First, in true swap fashion, you have to account for not just a weapon's firing time, but its ready and stow time as well. Both ready and stow values were calculated using Ophidian aspect where possible, on top of 3 matching dexterity mods. In addition, at the advice of Harm from D2 Foundry, I used the frame where my hipfire reticle changed in order to determine when a ready animation was starting, as well as when a stow animation was ending. Using these timings as well as little snapshot values of damage sourced from the other tabs, I calculated 2 values. First, a swap DPS value, which accounts only for input timings. Basically, this value is calculated by dividing the total damage done by whatever you're currently using by the time it takes you to ready, fire, and stow the weapon. Pretty simple, and this gives us a more direct component style look at, if I cram these inputs in this time, I will eventually get this much damage done to the boss, even if it's not in a short time. This method is certainly academically interesting, but oftentimes what we care about is when the damage is actually being dealt, not just how long it takes to get that damage fired from our weapons, if that makes sense. That's why I also calculated a true DPS value, which measures from the start of the ready animation to the final tick of damage actually being done. Where weapons like Anarchy and Witherhoard looked great in the swap DPS column, in reality these weapons do very little instantaneous DPS. Even rockets suffer a little with this change, since wolfpacks take about 2 seconds from impact to do their damage to a boss. Unsurprisingly, the top 3 options here are Parasite, Blade Barrage, and Grand Overture, with a special mention going out to Nighthawk Golden Gun, which towers above every other option if we account for the fact that it can be pre-popped. Oh yeah, the timing tab. This is just where I keep all the raw timing data for damage ticks for all the stuff in the previous 2 tabs. It's like the equivalent of the sequencing tab for the rotation section. Bosses. A recent addition to the spreadsheet, the Bosses tab was something I created while making the previous part of this video series. On top of displaying the actual scaled health of every raid and dungeon boss in the game, this tab goes over everything you'd want to think about when trying to craft a damage strategy around the boss encounter in Destiny. On top of including the specific weapons, supers, and class composition used by speedrunners, as well as attached clips of kills performed in previous runs, I've also included a little surprise in the final column where I approximate the proportional DPS the entire team is doing to the boss based on the actual health values I calculated before. Speaking of which, how did I actually calculate these values? I mentioned earlier that all my testing is based on a Templar health value of around 6.33 million. If the web screen numbers are unreliable in D2, how could I have gotten this number? Well, as you've seen in the values tab, not all weapons are unreliable, at least in solo damage testing. And so I picked two weapons, Xenophage and Sleeper, that I know behave consistently and proportionally on the health bar and wipe screen. To cover my bases, one does body damage and one does precision damage, and both are relatively simple to use and low to medium fire rate weapons that damage in chunks. In order to actually calculate these health values, I shot every raid and dungeon boss in the game with Xenophage and Sleeper repeatedly, marking down the percent or pixel count left in the health bar after each shot. After this, I plotted in-game visual damage done to the boss against health bar percentage chunks dealt. After doing this, a nice straight line would form in my scatter plot, and I would use a line of best fit calculation to create a linear function that I could then use to calculate a boss's health with high precision. If a boss had a higher than normal crit multiplier or odds scaling, all of this would show up either on the graph or in-game, meaning that I could extract all of the other values that I needed for this tab from these tests as well. Miscellaneous. You might have noticed a few odds and ends when it comes to the other tabs. Specifically, I'm going to spend some time talking about the Wolf Packs tab, since I think the confusing table found there has garnered some valid questions. Since Pack Hunter rockets are easily the most egregious offender when it comes to inaccurate true damage, I decided to dedicate an entire section of my spreadsheet to them. First, let's talk testing. Since I was using Templar for the rest of these tests, I decided to stick with him, but in the future I'm planning on redoing these tests on Tenix, a beefier boss without an annoying detain or a player dedicated to blocking teleports. However, I am confident enough in my results at this time to stand behind the numbers you see in this table. As of right now, every single one of these tests, besides Bipod and Full Team Shield Clip, was done with 4 players across 4 tests, shooting a total of 96 rockets. Speaking of numbers, that's a lot of numbers. What do they all mean? Let's work from left to right. In the blue informational section, we have a bunch of values that are strictly from the game itself. The base column means no Pack Hunter, and it's split into both the explosion and impact components of the projectile. The WP1 and WP2 columns are the visual numbers produced by the wolf packs buzzing around on screen. Sometimes these values may be slightly lower due to blast radius falloff, but generally Wolfpack rounds produce 2 different numbers, so I listed them here to document whether a perk affects Wolfpacks. Finally, the theoretical column applies the multiplier the game thinks Wolfpacks provide to all the base values. For reference, the game seems to think that Pack Hunter adds approximately 28% more damage to each rocket, which lines up with the 30% number that I see quoted by a lot of people. But as we know, boy is that number wrong. To the right of the informational section, we have the real section. First, we have the wipe screen value per rocket. This value is expected to be about equal to the theoretical value, and the W/T column divides the two to check whether this is accurate. However, as we know, not all perks affect Wolfpacks equally, on top of the wipe screen's existing inaccuracy, so it's no surprise that some of these values stray from a clean ratio of 1. The next 2 columns are the most important in this tab. First, the actual column is the true health bar damage per rocket, on average across every test. On top of this, there's also another value for every non-base test that divides each test value by the base rocket value. For example, based on these results, Explosive Light actually provides a 6% boost to a Pack Hunter rocket instead of the expected 25%, which makes sense given that we know Explosive Light doesn't affect Wolfpacks. A few other notable observations. Enhanced Surrounded actually does more than expected, Bait and Switch only does around 27%, Bipod is right on the money, Lasting Impression sucks, and Chill Clip actually decreases team damage. What might come as another shock is the AB column. This column represents the ratio between the actual health bar damage of a Pack Hunter rocket and a regular rocket. As we discussed, the game thinks that this ratio is about 1.28 or 28%. In reality, across all 96 tests, the average was 89.6% or nearly a 90% boost to base rocket damage. I actually tested solo initially and was intrigued by just how much extra health bar damage Pack Hunter rockets do, so I set up a much more advanced test with more players, ensuring that everyone was hitting their rockets together, and the results were astounding. It's no surprise that rockets are such a dominant force for DPS when Galahorn nearly doubles the true damage each rocket does. Don't get me wrong, even without Pack Hunter, rockets are still a dominant force, but this explains why the top rocket rotation in the ranking tab does nearly 3 times more true DPS than the top linear rotation. As for the other tabs, I'll save those for other videos, including some Pack Hunter retesting down the road. Just know that if you're curious about anything, provided you've watched the videos and looked at the spreadsheet so you know if it's been covered before, and you've put in the work to check that it might be worth using, I'm down to test anything that sparks my interest. I've got some more plans for the spreadsheet, but only a few of them will be videos. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone that has supported me in this nearly 3-hour journey through shooting bosses in a video game. Special thanks to my testing team, including Marge, Noxie, and Achilles, present for almost every Templar torture session, as well as Ducky and Mars, who I dragged through every dungeon in the game while I shot bosses with Sleeper and Xenophage. They didn't even get loot out of it. I don't know if I'll be able to make a video series as long and as in-depth as this one until it's summer again, but thankfully I have a lot of plans for much more digestible content coming soon. I'll probably make a few more damage-related videos separate from this series, targeted towards day 1 and interesting thought-provoking topics. See you in the next video, and take care everyone.